You've reached the Signal Watch, movies, television, comics, and more. I'm your host, Ryan Steens. Join me and our cadre of co-contributors as we examine cultural artifacts of the 20th century, boldly explore the 21st, and try to put it all in perspective. Stay tuned. We're gonna try to make this work. Hey everyone, just a quick addendum before we get started. I completely forgot to mention while we were recording the podcast that our guest today is actually the musician who provides the intro and outro music to this podcast. I can't thank him enough. He's been very generous in lending us his music and his talent. And anyway, if you've been enjoying that music, Juan is the person who provided it. So thanks again, Juan. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Signal Watch. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Steens, and with me today is a very special guest who's never been with us before, but he's a very long-time pal of mine. Introduce yourself, sir.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Juan Diaz.
Hey, Juan, thanks so much for joining us. You agreed to finally do a podcast because we're covering one of your favorite topics, and which is
Foundation, the streaming series, and almost certainly the books, which is really where I came to this from.
Yeah. So the series has been on Apple Plus. Juan and I intended to do this at the 5-episode mark, and then a confluence of events meant that we didn't. So we're doing it after, I believe, the 7th episode.
Now, have you actually seen the 7th episode?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you watch it yet?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't want to spoil anything for you by accident.
No worries.
And by the way, it's all blurred together for me at this point, so I'll never be able to talk about what happened in which episode, but I can talk about characters and story and stuff.
Doesn't matter.
So, I'm familiar with Asimov really from a bunch of short stories I read, probably 35 years ago. And I read the robot novels, the 3 robot novels, as well as iRobot. And those are the Lige Bailey, R. Daniel Olivaw books that were like kind of cops in space, cops in the future sort of thing. And those take place thousands of years, I believe, before these books, but within the same continuity.
That's right. But sorry.
Oh, I was say, and that's one of the things that's really interesting to me about Asimov's stuff is he definitely strays from it here and there, but he basically has a continuity of the future of man that he has kind of predicted himself in a very Harry Seldon-esque way. So I know you read the Foundation books and you're familiar with all that stuff.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm coming from when doing this the podcast. So I grew up on the Foundation books. Like I was one of those guys, and so I read the Foundation trilogy in my early teens. Like I was probably like 6th or 7th grade, something like that. And since then, I've read all 7 books. I've read the trilogy probably 3 or 4 times, but it's been a long time. Probably the last time was probably like a freshman, sophomore year in high school, something like that. And then the other ones, I've read the Foundation's Edge and Foundation and Earth probably just once, I think. So I'm not as familiar with those. It's been a long time, but the trilogy I'm pretty familiar with. But it was just one of those things where, so I was in a hard sci-fi phase, I guess, in my early teens. So like I read a lot of Arthur C. Clarke, right? Like 2001 in Space Odyssey, the book was probably my entry point. But I'd also read Rendezvous with Rama. I've read Fountains of Paradise, and then I was kind of looking for more of that kind of stuff. And then I read, well, at some point I read Larry Niven's Ringworld, right? And so it was one of those things where like I was in a phase where I was seeking a certain kind of sci-fi book. And every time I would go to the bookstore, because this was in the 80s, right? Like where you went to the bookstore in the mall. That's what you did.
Sure.
There was always like, Asimov had like his own shelf of like hundreds of books. And Foundation was there. And I knew enough about it to kind of know that that was probably what I ought to read. And like, it's the kind of thing that you can't avoid, but at least where my bookstores were, it was the trilogy in one book. So it was big and fat. And it just looked like really intimidating. Like it just looked like it was going to be a big, do I really want to devote this much time to this? And so I avoided it for a long time. But when I got into it, I got hooked. And so that's so basically, I guess I'm one of those people who grew up like, wanting, like waiting for somebody to turn it into a movie or a TV show, but like really hoping that nobody would ever turn it into a movie or a TV show. Like I'm one of those people, and I know I'm not alone.
Yeah. I mean, I want to start with the robot novels, if you look at them, are like super concrete. It's like there's a guy who's a cop and they kind of use this idea of like racism against robots to kind of frame things. And it makes a lot of sense within the context of the books. And if you start thinking about like robots taking jobs and all that sort of thing, how people would think of things like that in the future. And I've never understood how those didn't become movies or a TV show, because like the robot, even in the book, looks like a person. So like, you don't even have to do anything special there. You could just go, and that guy's a robot.
Right. It's a detective story. We know how to do that as movies.
Yeah. It all seems, and it blows my mind that wasn't the first thing they did, partially because they could have done Foundation afterward and people would have been like, oh, this is the same continuity. How crazy. But that's clearly not what they did. But Foundation, when I'd look at the books on the shelf, I'd look at the description. And frankly, for like my little middle school pea brain, I was like, that's too much. Like, I can't get my head around like that far in the future and the world being that different. And then I'd say about 15 years ago, I think I was in a mall, an airport bookstore rather. Oh. And they had Prelude to Foundation. And I was like, oh, I should probably read this at some point. And I read it. Actually, Jamie ended up in the hospital, and I read it basically in the waiting room in the hospital. And it was like, this is great. And then we moved right afterward, and I never finished reading like any real Foundation books after that. So I've always regretted it. So I was like, oh, well, easy squeezy. This TV show is coming out on Apple Plus. And you'd recommended it, but you also said to me, it's not exactly like the books. So, yeah. But I'm enjoying. I will say, I've been enjoying shows like The Expanse and things like that are out there. We haven't done that on the podcast or anything, but but it kind of feels to me in the same sort of we're actually trying really hard vein that The Expanse is doing, but the ideas are maybe not as nitpicky as The Expanse ideas are, but they're as well conceived and thought out because they've been kind of hammered on, I would say, from like, well, we have this book everyone knows and has thought about. And so, but just what is the major difference, if you had to sum it up in a couple of sentences, between the book and the books and what you're seeing on the TV show?
Oh gosh. That's we'll probably spend a lot of time talking about that, because I have some questions about like conceptual questions about screenwriting for you, but I mean, there's a lot of differences. I mean, if we had actually recorded this at the 5 episode mark, my answer would have probably been very different from my answer now after the 7th episode. My answer now is there's almost no resemblance to the books. Oh, wow. Which is like a crazy. I mean, I guess I can, like, one of the questions that I'll probably ask you, I can go ahead and preview it, is, when you're doing an adaptation, and I should say, I'm not a purist. There are some, if you go to the Twitter and Reddit, the Reddit Foundation group, there are some purists who are angry that like any minute detail of the book would be changed, and I'm not one of those people at all. And I also know what it takes to, not that I've actually done it, but I'm well aware of the kinds of compromises and the kind of opportunities that you have in adapting a book to a movie or a TV show. There's some things you can do that you can't do in books. So I'm not a purist, but one of my questions, especially after it got into episode 7, is what's the threshold? At what point have the number of changes you made either been so great or so fundamental of a nature that it's really not an adaptation anymore, that it's really just something totally different, but you're borrowing
that has the same
character names, right?
Yeah.
Because in my opinion, I think they've crossed that threshold, right?
Yeah.
But it's just my opinion. Some people are really, judging from like Twitter and Reddit, like some people are just now like really getting into the show, whereas some book people are like, what, WTF, and like quitting the series and all that kind of stuff. So it's,
you're allowed to swear on here, by the way.
Am I? Okay.
All you
Good
want
to know.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, it's not a children's show.
Yeah. The swear police are not going to come for you.
Okay.
That I'm aware of.
Okay.
It hasn't happened.
But without getting into too many details, because we'll probably get to it later on the podcast, my answer after seeing the 7th episode is, as far as like what actually happens, like nothing past the first episode happens in the books, like none of it.
Oh my God.
In the broadest sense, like, yes, there is Terminus, there's a colonist on Terminus, and yes, there is a crisis with the Anacreons, like that is, but like that's super broad. Like other than like that, like nothing after the first episode of the series happens, and more importantly, like none of the themes are the themes, like all the themes from the books are gone, and like the themes of the book seem to be to say, yeah, the themes in the book are wrong. These are our themes. We're going to contradict everything. So that's where I'm like, well, how can you still call this foundation if you're saying like what like the big themes of the book are about? Either you don't get it, or you're saying no, those are wrong. Our themes are 180 degrees opposite. So that's where I'm like scratching my head, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I totally get that. I mean, so I think the biggest change I've ever seen from book to movie, I mean, not going back to like Dracula or Frankenstein or something where it's like, they're really adapting stage plays, which hadn't been an adaptation because you only do so much on the stage, right? And there was a movie called Wanted that came out in about, I'd say 2007, 2008. That was an adaptation of a graphic novel. And literally the only thing they had in common were character names.
Okay.
And it was sold as, at the time, it's a comic book movie because it's based on this Mark Millar comic book. But I'd read the comic, didn't love it, but I'd read it and watched the film and walked out, and I was just laughing. I was like, I don't know what that was.
Okay.
I was like, the movie was fine. It was a little dumb. It was fun.
I was going to ask, could you enjoy it on its own thing? Because that's also the thing too. Like, you can recognize, well, this is not that, but I'll enjoy it for its own sake, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't particularly like the comic, so I liked the movie better. But it was like, I like hamburgers, but I don't like this cheesecake or something. They were so totally different.
Right.
But maybe they both shared the same name, and you're like, well, both of them have cheese. One's a cheeseburger and one's a cheesecake,
Right.
But yeah,
between two pieces of bread.
Yeah, it just was so fundamentally different, and it's interesting to hear that because I had been thinking, the last couple episodes, it had so much stuff about the Cleons and going out to this religious moon and all this stuff. I was like, none of this feels like Asimov. This was what I was thinking when I was watching it. I was like, this doesn't seem like stuff he'd be particularly interested in exploring. Maybe he'd reference it in a paragraph or a sidebar, but as far as like a major character beat, and he's not really about major character beats anyway.
Certainly not in the Foundation books, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he's much more about like people kind of being able to illustrate his ideas of how the future might work.
Yeah.
Through having some tension and whatnot. but I wouldn't say like I wept at the end of Caves of Steel because of the emotional journey I'd been on, you know.
Right.
So yeah, it's interesting to hear that it has diverged that much and is really heading into what feels like peak cable TV. Like, I think of shows like they've had various Roman Empire shows over the past few years and whatnot, and trying to turn it into sci-fi. And I'm not enjoying it. I'm not gonna walk any of that back. I'm just a little disappointed, but not entirely surprised to hear that Goyer has once again kind of done this, and
Yeah.
that's kind of been his bag, adapting things anyway.
Yeah, I'll be really interested to hear more about that from you. You have a much bigger sense of Goyer than I do. One thing that's really interesting is that, I mean, isn't he doing Sandman, which is coming out like next year or the year after that or something?
That's a little
Like that.
different because Neil Gaiman has his hands on it. He's not dead.
Oh, he's still involved. Okay,
He's
good.
the show. He's like one of the showrunners. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. He's not
And
dead.
there's a very alive and vocal fan base for the comic that I think they know if they piss them off, it's game over for the whole thing. So
Gotcha. That makes sense. But you said something interesting. I was just saying, well, David S. Goyer. So I mean, it's kind of interesting because like I've liked. There's a lot of things the show has done that I have liked that are nothing like in the book. It does also feel like it almost feels like somewhere around the fifth episode, like some key writers in the writers' room must have quit. Like it almost seems like even though like really none of the show is like the books, it almost feels like there's kind of a change in quality of writing or a change in tone, like right around the fifth episode where it almost feels like, did you have like 5 or 6 people quit? Because it almost seems like it's written by somebody else now. I don't know that. Who knows? But it is also interesting too, because so supposedly David S. Goyer has been wanting to make Foundation for like decades, because his dad was one of those like hardcore fans, gave him the book when he was 13 and he didn't get it, but then he read it again when he was like 20 and then he got it and really liked it, blah, 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 blah. So as far as I can tell, David S. Goyer is a legitimate Foundation fan. And I have listened to some of his interviews, and he's in the interviews, he sounds totally legit and totally like he's coming from a good place. So even when I listen to his interviews, it seems like a disconnect from the guy I'm listening to and the episodes that I'm seeing. Like I'll listen to him in the interviews. I'm like, yeah, that sounds right. Good, legit. He's coming from a good place. But, part of it too may come from the fact that, you were asking like, why did this get made and not any of the robot books? And I mean, I have no idea, right? But I have gotten the sense that if Apple was going to be the entity to pick up something from David S. Goyer doing something by Asimov, I do have the strong sense from some of the interviews and that I've read and some of the other podcasts I've listened to that Apple really wanted their own Game of Thrones. That's what they were looking for, because they're a young network, they're trying to build content, and that's what they wanted. We want our own Game of Thrones, and straight up. And so Foundation must have been the one that could be converted to something like that, much more than an R. Daniel Oliva book. So it might just be a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense. I mean, they're very worried about as so much of people have a very easy time understanding throne stories and kind of rites of ascension, and I mean that's what Game of Thrones entirely was about, right? And they kind of have turned it into that of trying to set up like, what are these factions going to be out there, eventually taking pot shots at each other in season 3 or whatever that they're planning to do. So yeah, I mean, I don't know a ton about Goyer other than he started off in comics. That's where I first saw his name. He was also doing some like B movies and whatnot. I see he was responsible for writing Kickboxer 2, The Road Back, and Doll Man versus Demonic Toys and whatnot. But he was also working in comics for a bit over in DC and was, I believe, working on Justice Society America. And and then he kind of slid over and was working with Nolan on the Batman films. And
Right.
the I think the controversial thing I would say is those movies are essentially not actually Batman.
Right.
They're neat.
Yeah.
I enjoy them a lot. I think
Yeah.
Dark Knight is one of the coolest, most visceral movies I've ever seen. But it bears pretty much zero. The closest you get to anything that happens in the comics is a little bit of Heath Ledger over like 3 movies. And I think that was more of what do they call it? Convergent evolution of kind of a concept of a character, of the Joker. But yeah, he's also responsible for a lot of what ended up happening with what, now the fans call the Snyderverse or whatever, because that was the next step to that. Was he then worked on Man of Steel, which had, Zack Snyder was the director and one of the producers on, but Nolan was one of the other original producers. And that was just to get this made, but they kind of took everything that direction. The Man of Steel movie, which you and I saw opening night together, I don't know if you remember, I walked out onto the sidewalk and looked at you and was like, I don't know what the hell that was.
I remember that.
And I just felt like I'd been hit in the back of the head with a baseball bat.
Yeah, you didn't throw up, but I kind of wondered if you might.
Yeah, I mean, it was just so disorienting to see something that was like, yeah, Superman's got 75 years of history, but we're going to throw all of that out the window to do this other thing that could have been Amazing Guy or whatever else they wanted it to be. It didn't need to be Superman.
Yeah. See, that's how I've been. I'm not to interrupt. Sorry. That's kind of how I've been feeling, because like take the story elements completely and plot elements completely aside. Foundation is about some very specific big ideas. And I've been watching this, and for a while it seemed like they would keep true to that, but now they're like saying those big ideas are going to flush them down the toilet. And so I'm like, what the fuck? That's kind of how I've been feeling. So
let's talk about what some of those big ideas are. I mean, I'd love to. So I will say, I only read Prelude to Foundation, and they use the word psychohistory every page and a half. I have not heard that word in 5 episodes, I don't think.
Okay. Yeah. Right. They barely mentioned it, and that's so fundamental to. I mean, the thing about and maybe there's probably no way we can do this podcast without at some point kind of defining what psychohistory is according to the books and how it works. But it's important story-wise, because psychohistory, as defined by the books, basically it lays down sort of the rules and limitations that the story is going to go by. It's the operating. These are the rules of the game. So in that sense, even if you're not interested in what if science kind of scenarios, it's still the story kind of grows out of the limitation and the rules of psychohistory. Well, at least the books do anyway. So if you want me to kind of go there without totally nerding out, okay.
No, please nerd out.
All right. So first of all, the way I would define what is Foundation, at least the trilogy, right? But in general, it's sort of it's the 1,000-year story of the fall of one galactic-wide civilization and the subversive engineering of the following galactic-wide civilization, right? And subversive is kind of important, I think. It's making that happen, sort of you can't stop the fall of the Galactic Empire. We're going to set up the next one. We're going to try to reduce the amount of years of barbarism that happens as much as possible, and then build the next civilization in our own image, or I guess in Harry Seldon's own image, right? So that's kind of my elevator pitch, right? And the way Harry Seldon can conceivably do that is through this mathematics of psychohistory that he's developed. He's supposed to be a genius, right? One of the Galactic Empire's best mathematicians, right? And so kind of the way psychohistory works, here's the idea is that he discovers, Harry Seldon discovers that so individuals, people are, there is free will, or is there, question mark? That's one of the questions that is always out there in the books. But presumably people are, you can't predict what they're going to do. They're free agents. People often act against their own best interests. They don't often know why they're doing what they're doing. They have biases. whatever. But once you start looking at people in really large numbers, right, trillions and quintillions of people and like, big masses of people, then all of a sudden you start getting these emergent properties that can be described mathematically. And that's kind of what he discovers, that, people are you forever unknowable why they do what they do, but it's at the large scale, there are these emergent properties that you can predict. And so it's sort of like the idea that if you look at one molecule of air, there's no way what its energy level or position in space is going to be a year from now. But if you look at the atmosphere as a whole, yes, you can mathematically describe weather patterns and run them through computers and do, and predict the weather a week from now, or the climate 100 years from now. Same idea. That's kind of how psychohistory is going to work, or does work. And so he comes up with this, he develops this mathematics to do just that. And through that mathematics, he discovers that the empire that he lives in is actually going to collapse in a few hundred years. And so at that point, he uses his mathematics to try to figure out how can we best, if not prevent the fall, how can we drive future history to affect the least amount of human suffering? I guess I should stop there. I don't know if I'm getting too abstract, but
no, I'm following you.
Okay.
Can't speak to the masses out there listening, but I've got
Sure. Well, okay. So, I mean, if you imagine that you've got this mathematics that you can run simulations on, right, on a supercomputer, you've got all the parameters in this case are sociological, economic, religious, political. You put these parameters in your computer, you run these simulations, and so you can essentially set up different starting scenarios and see what history is going to look like a 1,000 years from now. And so what he does to not, because I feel like I'm getting into like too much detail here, he basically preloads history. He sets up, he finds what's the best scenario. There are no utopias, but he figures out what are the best starting parameters to get to this point 1,000 years from now. And so he preloads history to go in that direction, right? Which is why he sort of maneuvers these colonists on Terminus, a planet that has no natural resources, is surrounded by all these hostile kingdoms. Like on the face of it, it seems like a terrible place to start a scientific colony. But it's all because he knows what these starting conditions need to be, so that at that point, you can just let history run, and it'll run and end up where his simulations show it's going to end up, at this new galactic empire at a mere 1,000 years from now, right? So maybe that's a good place to stop. I don't know.
Yeah, no,
or you tell me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and so that's basically my understanding, and I think the show tries until they get them on the ship out to Terminus to make that clear. I understood, at least where they were going with it. They have introduced, of course, the character of Gale, who's his kind of prodigy, or will be a prodigy. She has a very brief amount of time, as far as we understand, with Harry, long enough to fall in love with his
adoptive son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, how do I define race here?
Yeah.
But then it kind of gets into like, gee, this is another like sci-fi show where there's kind of brutal people in, kind of inefficient armor, coming to give the peaceful settlers a hard time. Like, and I don't know if any of that was in the books or I mean, it makes sense within the context of the show, but it also just didn't feel very Asimov-ish to me. It seemed like an incident that would be described in a page or two.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a lot of this stuff is just my opinion, right? Mm-hmm. But, one of the interesting things about I guess one of the challenges of turning the books into a movie or a TV show is that a lot of the action sort of happens between the pages. So a lot of the books, a lot of like what you're actually reading about in the books is about the machinations that have to happen between the different players for things to turn out the way they do, right? Mm-hmm. But the actual, like the pew pew war and action happens between the pages or between chapters. And so, for a movie, you want to make some of that stuff explicit, because that's going to be what makes it kind of more exciting to watch. And I recognize that, right? But having said that, there's no reason from the way the books are written that there can't be really exciting action. I mean, you're telling the story of the collapse of a galactic empire and the subversive engineering of the next one. There's going to be wars, right? There's going to be religious revolts. There's going to be executions. All that stuff is in there, but it's kind of more implied, or it may be told, but in certain ways where it's not, like way later, like in the second book. And I'm not giving any spoilers. There is a story of the complete destruction of a planet by a rogue imperial general that resembles a lot sort of the bombing of Anacreon and Thespis in the second episode here. Mm-hmm. But it's told from it's the memories of a broken old man who used to be part of the nobility when his planet was still part of the empire. So it's kind of like these like sad reminiscences from this broken old man, as opposed to the book's actually like telling you in real time as it's happening, right? But it's not that these violent events don't exist in the book. They're just not front and center to the machinations that happen, right?
So that actually reminds me, one of the things you'd brought up when we were talking about this a little bit a few weeks ago was the Foundation books were not originally like Asimov wrote a book and sent it, a PDF file to an editor or something. They were short stories appearing originally in Amazing Fantasy, I think.
That's right, yeah.
Or Amazing Stories, rather.
Yeah.
And so, pulling those, and that's when I think about like iRobot and the attempt to turn that into a movie. If audience, if you've ever read iRobot, it's not a book; it's a collection of short stories. And the idea of having Dr. Susan Calvin running around with like a laser gun is hilarious. Like she's a kind of nebbishy, middle-aged to older lady through most of the books, who just wants to deal with the robots. She's not a pretty young police officer or whatever the hell they turned her into. I'm having a hard time remembering iRobot because I tried to scrub it from my mind immediately after watching it.
Oh, you scrubbed the movie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not the book. The book they try to keep there. But yeah, it doesn't entirely say, like iRobot also had like, short stories about like, the cars were programmed slightly different from robots as far as like whether or not they would injure somebody, because they have to make different decisions when they're on the road. Okay. And so the cars at the end like team up on some guy, and like you basically realize at the end of it, it's turned into a Christine with 16 cars about to take some dude out. And that of course is not going to be in a Will Smith movie where he's it's about him like karate kicking robots or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the Cleons, they've gotten very much into the need to have the kind of, what is it, dawn, day, and dusk.
And dusk,
yeah. Is that at all in the books?
No, that's a complete fabrication. But having said that, that's actually one of the things that I've liked about. I thought that was a cool, interesting change, and an interesting way of handling one of the challenges. I mean, I think they could play it too far, and having gone to episode 7, I'm feeling like they might go too far with it in the next season. We'll see, but for the most part, I thought that was kind of an interesting way of handling one problem, which is, so one of the challenges of the book is that even though it's about the collapse of this galactic empire, the empire itself is like kind of in the background. I mean, other than like the first section of the first book, the Psychohistorians, essentially is the first episode in the series. It's the trial of Harry Seldon. After that, like you never hear about the empire again, for a long time. Like it's all Terminus and the surrounding planets, and the empire is sort of in the background, right? And you don't want to make a story about the empire where you just kind of like forget the empire and you're never there. It's just kind of more this idea of like political things that are happening 50,000 parsecs away. So, but at the same time, the empire as an idea is something that spans centuries. So I actually like the way they gave the empire a face, and the idea of these clones is an interesting way of sort of keeping that face around for a few centuries and giving the audience somebody they can they can feel emotionally invested in, even if he's not really the same person, right? It's like different iterations of the same person, but even that like has lots of interesting things you can do with it. And they've kind of been doing that. Like what happens when each iteration of Cleon like thinks the previous iteration kind of screwed things up, or maybe they want to carve their own path. There's some interesting stuff that you could go into there. So for the most part, I've kind of liked that, but yeah, that's definitely not in the books for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, I'm not entirely surprised to hear that wasn't something Asimov went in to explore. I can see him again spending a few pages on it of like, see, so audience, you understand, like, yeah, like to his audience, like, well, you guys understand how this is working. Good, got it. And so for a very similar reason, but hearing that that wasn't ever part of it. At the same time, I mean, it really leans into, do you care about, the current Dawn's, romantic foibles with the gardener?
Right.
And, obviously it has huge implications. It's also a little like, yeah, but this is really the first time in 400 years this has happened.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and there's a few different things like that within the show that just even dealing with, and I've noticed this a little bit in sci-fi of late that I've been watching. Like one of the things that just took me out, honestly, of the last episode was they go to Invictus, this ghost ship, and which I honestly thought that was a interesting idea, that it keeps warping everywhere, and that's why everyone thinks it's a Flying Dutchman sort of thing. But they're like, oh, it's 700 years old. Well, I'll just patch into the control panel here.
Yeah.
And I was like, no.
Yeah.
That's like me getting on a tall ship and thinking, oh yeah, I know how to drive a boat around Lake Travis. I totally know how to, sail a tall ship, across the ocean. It's like, it's just not the same thing.
Yeah. Or even something as mundane as like a computer expert from today being able to program a mainframe from the 1970s, right? From just 40 years ago. That episode 7 drove me crazy. Not even like aside from whether I like the books or not, aside from how much I think the story, the movie should be true to the books. Aside from all that, it just drove me crazy because it was like every minute had like 3 plot holes. It was like plot hole after plot hole after plot hole. Like it just drove me crazy. I'm like, how, this is insane. Like nothing works. Like everything is so stupid. But yeah,
no, I mean,
and that was one of them. That was
you're not watching any of the new Star Trek stuff, are you?
No, I haven't, but maybe, I don't know. Should I?
Well, I mean, Voyager, spoiler, decided between, I guess, season 2 and season 3 that it was going to jump 1,000 years in the future. And like everything's basically the same with some slightly cooler doodads. And I'm like, no, that's not. You guys had figured out beaming and like lasers and how to like get around the galaxy. Like it should have been an inconceivably different universe that they ended up in 1,000 years.
Yeah. Ago. I mean, yeah.
And I can kind of say, okay, the Foundation stuff's happening so far in the future that maybe things kind of level out. Like you can only make a wheel so efficient, right? It's a round thing that spins, right?
Sure.
And okay, so maybe starships can only become so, but over 700 years.
Yeah. Well, and there's things that that don't even depend on how much technology changes or not. Just basic, like, is your character an idiot or not? Like Farah, at least, if not the other Anacreons, is supposed to be like a really keen huntress, like, general, right? Whatever. And so, well, in episode 7, right? So the what's his name? Dorwin, right? The general from the Empire. So, and this is such a plot contrivance anyway. So the reason they need him is because he's got these nanobots floating in his blood. That's the only way to unlock the airlock, right? Which just right there, I was rolling my eyes, right? But then like the thing that just drove me crazy is like, so this Farah, this genius who knows nothing about this ship, like is absolutely certain that she's not going to need those same nanobots for anything else she might have to do in the future, right? Like overriding a jump or arming the ship's weapons or nothing. She just shoots them on. Or turning it on. Like there's,
or that those nanobots would work 1,000 years. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like the nanobots from today are compatible with nanobot readers from 700 years from now. Right. But yeah, but even going back a couple of episodes, right? Like just like the thing that just broke it for me, and that's not to say that I'm not still enjoying it, but like, so Farah's big plan was that they're going to indiscriminately murder everybody in Terminus, and then hope they haven't killed the scientists and engineers that they need for their big plot, right? Like there's no like for hours, right? That they invade at night, and like by mid morning they're still indiscriminately killing people in a town that obviously can't have more than like 10,000 people in it, right? It's not a big town.
Yeah, I thought it was
right?
like maybe a few hundred people.
Right. And then they ask, like, where are your important folk? Like, I would have loved if they had said, well, they're all dead because you killed them. End of story. Like, that just drove me nuts. And obviously none of that is in the books, but like, it's just stupid. It's like, okay, at this point, I just don't care about anybody because like the villains are idiots. And, you know, it's just, and that's just 2 of like 100 of these plot. Yeah. Yes. So I'm with you. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's still entertaining enough. It's still big budget and they're trying hard enough. The production value is high enough. If this were, you know, a show from the mid 90s where, you know, you could see all the seams, you know, everywhere. I don't know how much I'd still be planning to stick with it. I mean, but it's you know, it's well written enough. It had enough momentum behind it to kind of get to this point. But I am very curious to see what note they're going to decide they're going to end on. I guess there's 4 more episodes coming up, and I feel like they're just getting started, and that's not particularly a great place to be at the end of like 11 hours of TV.
Yeah, the Terminus thread in particular has really been dragging. Like it's taking them forever to like not say a lot.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I kind of get where they're going with, you know, the day and, you know, going to this moon and the, you know, the religious factions and whatnot, but it also feels kind of inevitable whatever's going to happen with this. And it's kind of like, or you could have done this in like an episode, not drag this out over like 3 or 4, which is what you're clearly planning to do.
Yeah.
So I think they're a little bit too much up their own self with a lot of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot I can forgive. I mean, first of all, and you know, trust me, as one of these like young nerds who love the series, I did think about like how might this possibly be doable as an interesting show or TV or movie. And I do think there are ways that could have been handled if you look at it from a different lens. That might be something to talk about. But I mean, ultimately, I can forgive a lot of stuff because, you know, it's a TV show about space stuff. Okay. There's going to be like laser guns and space cowboys, whatever. There's a lot that that in the books, maybe I wouldn't forgive, but in the show, it's like, hey, it's entertaining. It's cool. I'm getting my popcorn. I'm cool with it. But, you know, there's a lot of really fundamental stuff that they break, you know, so, you know, one of the themes in the books that's there all the time is that you're always questioning, their books are always questioning, is there free will? Does free will matter? Right? Or if there is free will, does it matter at the level of the scope of history, or do people's actions not matter at all? Or are they all just following the invisible hand of, in this case, Harry Seldon, but, you know, in real society, the invisible hand of God or whatever. But for psychohistory to work, for it to be believable at all as the basis of a story, a couple things have to be true. And one of them is that there are no chosen ones. There are no messiahs in the books, right? And 2, that the people that are sort of subject to psychohistorical analysis are not aware of that psychohistorical analysis, because as soon as they know sort of how their actions are going to affect future history, they're going to change the way they behave, right? They have to be operating in the blind. And so little things like Gale was supposed to lead the Foundation is a big no-no. But the biggest no-no now is that, like, apparently there are chosen ones. Like Salvor Hardin is a chosen one, and now we know that Gil can absolutely, like, just by sheer force of magic, know what the future is going to be, and that completely breaks what the books is about. And I will say, kind of sort of spoiler without getting too much spoiler territory. Once you get into the second and third books, there are people that have these mental abilities, but it's absolutely not that they can see the future. It's still kind of fits into the theme of like really advanced psychology.
So, yeah, right? And I kind of wondered, because that was the big reveal at the end of the 7th episode, was Gail believed she could see the future.
Yeah, to the point that she knew that this one meteorite was going to break through the hull of the ship, and she caught it right then and there. Right, that this random event happening like 5 seconds or like, yeah.
And to me, it's actually like way more like, I'm so over Chosen One stories. Like the aughts were full of them, and I think it's like the most boring thing for the most part that you can actually do with the story at this point. But I know that TV and movies are just absolutely addicted to the idea. And I, if they need to pull together a very special team of, the Foundation Avengers or whatever to carry the Foundation forward, okay. But the notion that Gale was at some point, the same way she was constantly counting primes, intuitively at this point, understanding the math, Harry's math, enough that she could kind of, there was just a subroutine running with her. So she was understanding, events enough around her to predict what was about to happen at a more micro level. I could kind of buy that if they sold it that way rather than, by the way, magic.
Yeah, I mean, she's a mathematical genius, right? If she can count primes, I could buy that, right?
Yeah, and but then you bring up the like, oh, and then a stone flew through the window, and it's like, yeah, they did do that, didn't they?
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going on with the warden. Clearly, there's some suggestions of magic there as well. So yeah, I don't. It seems like a really weird fit, and something that I mean I can see writers who are like, okay, our mission is to make another Game of Thrones, not blinking at all about putting these things into a story.
And again, that may have been one of Apple's stipulations. I mean, I don't know, but but it's just, for me, it's just one of those things that once you have characters that can just sense the future, like there's no reason to have psychohistory as a mathematics at all in the story. Like you've just there's no need for it. Like you've just broken it. Like even for the TV series, it's like at this point you might have not even brought it up, because now you're probably going to have to retcon some stuff in the future to make your own story as you've envisioned it in your TV series work. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It'll be interesting how they deal with it. But
yeah, I think I can see them saying, okay, there's a macro level all of this stuff works on, and a micro level of kind of individuals pulling the levers. And I do think that's where psychohistory, the notion of it being large systems, starts to fall apart. I mean, one of the things I found interesting, even, I was in my 20s or 30s, I don't know how old I was when I read Prelude. And they were just doing it was the book's more or less about Harry figuring out psychohistory and trying to tell a pal about it. And I probably just really offended some fans from, I just gave my synopsis there. But I mean, I'm a history major, right? I mean, part of being a history major is you walk out of your history classes and you go, oh shit, we do all of this over and over again. And that's kind of the point of getting a history degree or studying history, is you are the canary in the coal mine. You're the person who says, oh, if you have these sets of circumstances, this is how you end up with like a fascist regime. This is how you end up, this is usually what you see as civilizations begin to tumble. I mean, things are different now in the 21st century than they were, 400 years ago. But you can still, paint a pretty rough idea. It's not just about knowing, what are the origins of Thanksgiving or whatever the hell they usually ask historians about.
Right.
But it's the kind of merging of kind of human psychology with that idea, and then saying, oh, by the way, you can actually do all of this with mathematics. I frankly believe it to be true.
Yeah.
When I was reading the book, I was like, yeah, no, this absolutely sounds like a very possible thing to do all through modeling and, in computers in the next 100 years.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you say that, because there were several things that really, really hooked me on the book at the time. And the plausibility of it. Psychohistory as a math is still a completely fictional thing, right? But the way it's explained in the books felt really plausible. And the idea that the events of this 1,000-year history could actually be engineered through this very plausible sounding mathematics just like really hooked me. And it's funny actually that you mentioned that, because since the stories were written, there are, psychohistory is still completely fictional, but there are areas of mathematics that are real that have come up since then that look like, I don't know, distant cousins to it. So like game theory is one. Yeah. There's another one called cliodynamics that looks a lot like certain aspects of psychohistory that are actual areas of research that people are doing now, which is not to say that psychohistory exists, but it is to say that there's a reason why, for me anyway, it felt really plausible. And so, a lot of, I think, given that so much of the books is just people talking, and given that so much of the action happens between the pages, why is it that the books, what is it about the books that makes them interesting? And I think it's more like a Sherlock Holmes story, right? If you read a Sherlock Holmes book, you go into it expecting that Sherlock Holmes is probably going to be fine, right? What draws you in is seeing how Sherlock Holmes puts all the pieces together and unravels the mystery, right? That's what's really engaging about those kinds of books, and that's sort of how Foundation the books work, So seeing how Harry Seldon maneuvered the colonists on Terminus so that all these things would kind of fall into place, whether the individuals in the colony were smart or idiots. Like, it wouldn't have mattered if Salvor Hardin was the mayor in the books or anybody else was the mayor. And I do think there are really interesting ways to handle that. And I can go into that if you want. And
sure.
That might be something to talk about. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, so, if you're going to do something like Foundation and turn it into a movie or TV series, a lot of it is going to kind of depend on what lens you're looking into. And, the space cowboy thing is the obvious thing, because we've seen that so much in movies, right? And, Star Wars is going to be one. Chosen Ones are going to be really, really tempting to go there. But if you look at the Anacreon Crisis, like in the books, and without getting into spoilers, right? In the books, it's this sort of geopolitical balance of power kind of thing, right? When you've got Anacreon and 3 other kingdoms that are all hostile to each other, and whose military technology has kind of become this sort of B-grade military technology. They've all become independent from the Empire. They're all hostile to each other. And then in the middle of that, you've got Terminus, which he's gotten cut off from the Empire. They are surrounded by all these hostile kingdoms. They're completely incapable of defending themselves, have no natural resources, but it's this planet of like scientists and engineers, right? And so how does that play out? And of course, that was on purpose on the part of Harry Seldon. Like, he knew they were going to be stuck in this situation, so that they end up getting maneuvered where they only have one option for how to deal with it. That won't go beyond that because it's spoiler alert after that. But when you think about that, like, or when I thought about that, I was thinking, that actually could be really interesting to deal with if you just kind of look at the story through a different lens. And so maybe instead of looking at it through like an action sci-fi kind of lens, I thought for a long time, I thought, that could be really interesting if you think of it more from like the perspective of like a Cold War era thriller of subterfuge and intrigue, right? So if instead of Star Wars, your models are maybe something like Hunt for Red October, right? Or The Manchurian Candidate, right? Or even something like that with this pervasive sense of paranoia, right? Like Oliver Stone's JFK, right? I think there's a way to kind of build this like geopolitical balance of power story in a way that is really gripping, that doesn't rely on just people shooting stuff. And you know, there's going to be people shooting stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's just to say that I think there are angles to get into that story that could have been really gripping for an audience that haven't read the books, if you just think of it in a different way from the way you're sort of used to seeing space epics told. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, when you were talking earlier a bit about, you know, kind of the blunt force approach of the Anacreons in the TV show, and that's not really, you know, anything that you'd see. And I definitely thought at that, you're saying that, like, well, yeah, wouldn't it have been more interesting if, you know, there'd been one or two people who showed up in, you know, some stranded, why are they here? And maybe they thought that was going to take too long to play out. But to your point, like they flip-flopped it. And so you end up with, we're shooting indiscriminately, wandering around this town, and oops, we just killed the three people we needed. And yeah, it just felt so much like those characters in particular, the Anacreons, felt like they'd been pulled from, you know, 5 other things I've seen, and, you know, if not more. And, you know, the cutesy thing of having the hunter carrying around a bow and arrow in the year, you know, 12,000, and you're just like, really?
Yeah.
Really? You're telling me they don't have like finger lasers or something that she would be using instead? Like, I get that they would have a bow, but I do not believe that would be anyone's weapon of choice in the year, 12,000 or whatever.
I see that. I was kind of okay with that because I kind of gathered that she keeps it as a sort of symbolic thing. But no, I still like, I'm kind of okay with it.
But by the time you get to the year 12,000, a laser bow is going to be anachronistic.
Oh, that's true. Like, yeah, do they even? Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, like a
Chewbacca style crossbow, right?
Sure. I mean, you could probably buy one on Amazon now. I'm not even kidding. I bet if I went to Amazon right now,
an actual working one, right?
Laser crossbows. There's something.
Totally. Christmas is coming up.
I was gonna say. So you never know what's going to show up, you know. But yeah, I mean, I am enjoying it on a certain level. Part of me is, I think Lee Pace is a good actor. I didn't love, oh God, what was that show everybody loved?
With Lee Pace?
Yeah, it was the 1980s computer show. Halt and Catch Fire.
Oh, right, yeah.
I found that show incredibly taxing. It like both wanted to be Mad Men and tell the story like way too fast. Talk about something where I felt like the writers weren't talking to each other. Yeah, it was craziness watching that show. He was fine in it, but the show, and he's been in a couple of Marvel movies at this point. I don't know if you know, because you don't watch any of those, but
I mean, I know some of the ones he's been in, but yeah, I haven't seen them.
Yeah, he's really good, and he's hilarious. Honestly, he's not. I mean, he's supposed to be in Captain Marvel, but it's just because you've already seen the character in other movies.
Yeah. And he's got some line. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Anyway, I mean, and I think the other guys, you know, who they've had in for Dawn and Dusk have been, you know, really, really solid. But I also feel like I'm watching like 3 different shows right now on the same show, which is kind of interesting. Like that's not necessarily a knock against it. It's just like, I'm assuming at some point you people will pull all of this together.
Yeah, they only have 3 episodes left.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah.
I mean, if they can, you know, I might eat my words. If we ever record a follow-up podcast, I might say, well, you know what? I was totally wrong about everything.
Well, but at
this point, they've got 3 episodes left to try to put together a lot of stuff.
I just saw that they're doing 11, not 10.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Okay.
So hopefully, we got four more hours of this, in which, they put a little bit of at least enough to pull things together to propel things into a second season.
Yeah.
I have no idea what the numbers are like, and it's Apple Plus. So who knows? It's not like Ted Lasso where everyone's at the water cooler, like, did you see what Roy did, last week?
I have no idea. I mean, they greenlit a second season fairly quickly, so their numbers must be well enough.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't have a clue.
Yeah, and with shows like this and everything they probably have to do to pull everything together, I assume they had to know pretty early so they could get it out in a year.
Yeah,
less than a year.
This might be the kind of show where you have to build an audience too. I mean, I don't know. I mean, did Game of Thrones have a huge built-in following right off the bat? My sense is that,
in fact, it's kind of funny. I was watching the first season of Game of Thrones, and the finale happened, and I was like, I'm done. Or the finale of the first season, I was like, I'm not getting into yet another thing where I have to learn like about a bunch of fictional countries and shit. Which I know sounds crazy coming from me, but at the same time, I was like, I don't know enough about my own planet. At the time, I remember going, I don't understand enough about why World War I started that I'm going to care about why they're getting into like Dragon Town and all of this stuff. And I kind of regret it. I kind of wish I watched it. My rule was, tell you what, I've seen the first season. It was more than passable TV. If at the end of the series, because I heard it was going to have a finale, I was like, if I hear it, the last season is awesome, I will go back and watch it. And then everyone was like, that was garbage. And I was like, well, I saved myself quite a bit of pain, I guess. So I'm sorry I wasn't on the journey there with everybody, but I mean,
I didn't. Now I know I didn't waste my time or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I shows have such a hard time sticking the landing, that I've gotten used to tell you, because I did the whole Lost thing, and ever since then, you know what?
But it's funny that you mentioned the whole like it's hard to stick the landing, and it's true. It's absolutely true. And something that is epic and has 1,000 threads that you have to weave, like I almost don't blame the writers if it happens, but like if there's any one series that doesn't have an excuse, it would be this one for the fact that they had like they're working off pre-existing material. But also, I do know this from some of the interviews that I've read with David Goyer. Apple insisted before they committed to funding it, they said, we want you to write at least a fairly detailed synopsis of all 8 seasons. We're not committing to funding 8 seasons, but we want to know that you're going somewhere with this, precisely so that you don't get to this point halfway into that where you're like, you've walked, put yourself into a corner and you don't know how to get out of it. And then you have to do a bunch of stupid shit. So as part of the pitch, in order to get this greenlit, the series greenlit at all, they actually had to write at least synopses of every episode of all 8 seasons. So they don't have a lot of excuse to kind of getting themselves into a corner, and
that's actually a relief to hear, because I mean that's happened. I mean, so maybe they know what they're doing. I'm still mad about X-Files just kind of flailing around. And I know other people out there, oh no, X-Files was great till the last second, and I'm like, no, dude,
I'm with you.
X-Files,
I love the X-Files at the time, but
the last couple of years on that show were hilarious. I gave up anyway, and that's scarred but smarter. If I don't want to go back and watch another show that's going to be that way. So no, it's good to hear. Honestly, I'm glad that Apple was being that intelligent about it. If they were going to get invested in something on this scale, certainly they had an opportunity to learn from what happened with HBO. Because there were a lot of nerves with, there were supposed to be another book, and as far as I know, George R.R. Martin still hasn't put out another Game of Thrones book, and he's had like at this point, I'd say 10 years or something like that.
I mean, isn't even that's a running joke, right? That's a meme at this point, isn't it?
My guess is he's hanging on to it till he's dead.
Oh, you mean that it's actually written?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good guess. Yeah.
My guess is he doesn't want to hear the feedback on whatever he did.
Oh.
and he's like, this will be the definitive version. I won't get any pressure because I'll be dead.
Yeah.
And everyone will just have to deal with my posthumous, release of this thing.
Right.
And it's funny, Asimov himself as a guy, I mean, he was a teacher. He wrote like hard science books. And so it really informs kind of, the structure of a lot of his fiction and the kinds of characters who appear in his fiction. And that's part of what I was not expecting going in to this was all of the like Cleon in the desert with, things flapping around him, and I will go on a spiritual journey with you. And oh, by the way, my robot has found religion, which I'm just like, that doesn't feel very Asimov-y at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it in some ways it does. In some ways it felt very Asimov-y, but I'm like, it depends on how it plays out, because there's always a lesson in whatever the weirdness is. After he's set up whatever the ground rules are. So I'm kind of waiting to see what they do with that. But
yeah. In general, obviously, I have no problem. For movies, you kind of need to have characters that people can feel invested in. I totally get that. And, it's funny in the books. You'd mentioned that. Even if maybe not to the extent that other books might, but even in iRobot, the characters weren't. That it wasn't about the characters necessarily. The books definitely aren't, right? The Foundation definitely. The characters are just vehicles for the story and for the ideas. For me, that was actually kind of a feature and not a bug at the time. And I still think that wouldn't be right for a TV adaptation or a film adaptation. But, at the time, kind of, if I'm going to be reading 1,000-year history, like 500 years into this, I don't want to be reading about the same people, because it's just going to make the universe seem really small, and it's going to start seeming implausible. Like if I'm reading a real history, like a world history book, and I just finished the section on, I don't know, the Holy Roman Empire, and now I'm reading about the Ottoman Empire, but it's still all the same characters, I'm going to be like, what the fuck? So to me, like the fact that like, every few sections in the Foundation books, it's all new characters, and the characters from the previous section have been dead for decades. And they're different kinds of characters. In the last one, they may have been politicians and generals, and now it's merchants and religious priests and stuff. That actually, to me, added to it.
Yeah.
But having said that, that you can't really do it. You can't. That's not something you can translate one-to-one in the books. Yeah. But yeah, if the Cleon clones, if hundreds of years after the Empire has collapsed, if we're still dealing with clones of Cleon the First, it's going to start really stretching that sense of plausibility. We'll see.
Yeah,
and you also want characters you care about. Like at this point, I really liked Gale, like in the first few episodes, and after episode 7, I was like, I don't give a shit about Gale at all. And I actually really liked her at the beginning, but of course that's just me.
I'll be honest. Yeah, I mean, they also have done the thing where she's spent like 3 episodes, I guess now, like just flailing, and it's not that interesting, to be honest.
What's her arc?
Yeah, it's like she's just freaking out on a boat. Like it's it feels a little like end of Lost, sort of like, okay, we know who this character is, but we don't know what to actually do with them at this point. Or and the thing is, they didn't need to do anything with her. She could have just been off screen the whole time. Her discovery of where they're headed is not fundamentally that interesting. And I guess the discovery of what happened actually with Harry, but it just feels overwrought for what they needed. I mean, I'm sure somebody's enjoying it. I'm kind of like, okay, I get it. Get back to the other stuff. So it just feels really early, honestly, in the series for me to be going through this. There's something on the Expanse in season 5. There was quite a bit with one of the characters who was stranded on a ship. It went on for a few episodes, and to me that was like way more interesting, because you already were invested in that character in a very different way. And there was way more life and death going on with that character, and I couldn't not make a comparison between the two. And I don't know. I mean, we'll see. Maybe I'll be totally turned around on all of this by the time we get to the 11th episode. But
Yeah.
it was just kind of like get on with it with all of this stuff with Gail right here, because she seems like overly furious with everything, and that's not an interesting acting or writing choice.
Yeah. I mean, I'll stick to the end of the season. I mean, at this point, I'm so invested in it's.
Oh yeah.
There's only, I guess, 4 episodes left. Will I go on to the next season? I don't know. We'll see. It may end up being one of those things that, because I love the book so much, that I may be one of those people that I suspect I'm not the only one who hate the series but can't not watch it.
Sure.
We'll see. And is frustrated the whole time. Hopefully, I'm not one of those people, but I may.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think. Okay, so probably to wrap it up, the things I do like about the show, I think that there's really big ideas in it. I think it's interesting to see people exploring those big ideas. I've not seen someone talk about we're worried about things for the next 1,000 years. I mean, that is still remains kind of the big setup. I think the casting of Harry Seldon is excellent. Jared Harris is a great actor, and he was actually on The Expanse as well briefly. Mm-hmm. I just think that there's a lot of interesting places to go, maybe with the Cleons, especially this youngest one. I have a feeling, though, it's going to feel very cheesy, whatever happens with that guy. And I'm kind of curious to kind of see how they're actually going to say what the hell the Foundation is and what it's doing, and
what's the point.
Yeah, and because one of the things I think I said on social media, I used to work in digital libraries, was, these guys are doing the same work we do in digital libraries. They're trying to preserve the record, so there's something to get to for the future. That was always the very dark, weird secret of what we were doing in a lot of the work I did. We don't talk about it, but it was we're trying to do something in case the state of Texas falls into the ocean.
Right.
Who has done anything to make sure there's a record of, we know we're going to lose all the physical stuff.
Right.
So what happens if that you just end up with an Indiana Jones archive of the stuff and no one knows where anything is 50 years hence. Mm-hmm. But with the digital stuff, that's a huge problem. And so it's well, what is the work we're going to do to try and set things up for success for the future, for after we retire, so people will know what we actually have. And how do we make it accessible? And you start getting into a lot of philosophical and theoretical things. I remember I was working a lot in digital preservation, and I remember at midnight one night just going, oh my God, preservation doesn't work unless it's entirely open and available for access. Otherwise we lose everything.
Okay.
Because the idea was to put everything into the dark, and it still kind of is, but unless someone is looking at this stuff, you're going to end up losing it, right? And so, or not be as aware of it. You don't have a card catalog in quite the same way as libraries and archives tend to. So that's the kind of stuff that was kind of interesting to me about the Foundation, of what kind of Harry was describing, that he wanted to get set up on Terminus. And they haven't really returned to that at all. It's just mm-hmm. been lasers and pew pew. And I'm you guys need to actually get back to, the show is called Foundation.
Yeah. The colonists could have been anybody.
Yeah.
Why were they academics, right?
Yeah. And I was kind of I really, really was looking for more of that. I can see kind of, okay, we're going to watch over here as the Cleons accidentally blow themselves up, so we understand that Harry was right. Of course, Harry's going to be right. It's Jared Harris. But it's, we it's fine to watch the fall, but we also need to see the actual foundation being built. And I feel like the show needed to lean into that more and less of, oh no, Gail's having a bad time. because she's trapped in a spaceship with environmental controls. So.
Right. Yeah. I guess since we're wrapping it up, and hopefully I haven't been too negative. I have been enjoying the show. I guess I should kind of follow your lead, and there are some things I haven't. I'm still enjoying about the show. One of them, their depiction of Trantor is dead on. I mean, it's exactly how I imagined Trantor to be from reading the books. And based on episode 7, it looks like we're going to see more of it than just the Imperial Palace and some white shots of the cityscape. Looks like we'll probably go into the what are they calling it? The gash, whatever. Their depiction of Trantor is dead on. Lee Pace has had some great lines. I've actually, his takedown of the Imperial mathematicians, like that whole scene I loved. And there was
that was
one
why
line
they hired Lee Pace. That's what he do.
For that one, there was one line that honestly I was like, oh my God, that's something I probably wished to have said at work at some point in my life, when he was like, what do you do in your mausoleum of calculus if not achieve results? And I was like, oh my God, I know I've wanted to say that sometime in my at work. So, I am enjoying. And the universe feels as big as it ought to be. That was one of the things that I loved about the books, is that the galaxy felt as expansive as the stories claimed it ought to be. And so far, I'm still getting that from the book, from going and seeing the different cultures and the different planets. So,
yeah, without it turning completely alien, it feels like, okay, I can see humanity doing this. I can see humanity doing. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's hard for me to conceive of trillions of humans, to be honest. When we're having such a hard time with like a few billion running around this planet. And I know this means, I was like, but if you mathematically extrapolate how many planets they would have had to have colonized,
it would have to be right.
It would be a lot of planets, man.
A lot of people,
billions of planets. So it's an interesting. They've never said how many planets are colonized, because if they say a planet, people know what they're talking about. And I'm like, dude, I couldn't tell you the capital of all 50 states right now if I had to go my. So
and it's funny, the show keeps it smaller for good reason. I actually agree with their change. In the books, I think it's 25 million planets, and the population of the galaxy is in the quintillions. And Goyer was like, people don't know what the word quintillion is. They're going to be like, is that a real word? So they kept it to trillion. People know what trillion is because they hear it on the news. So it's even worse in the books. I guess I have one statement of hope, which is probably a good place to end it if you do want to end it.
Sure,
but my big, statement of hope is, because Dune just came out at the same time, and they're very different, but at the same time they're very comparable. I mean, Dune was almost written as a response to Foundation. I mean, Frank Herbert had definitely read Foundation before he wrote Dune. And these adaptations are coming out at the same time, although they're very different takes on a galactic society. But I guess my statement of hope is, and I haven't seen Dune, but I definitely plan to, and it seems like people are really loving this version. But I think it's the 4th attempt, isn't it? I think it's the 4th attempt to make Dune, and this is the first attempt for somebody.
I know about. It's the 3rd filmed one, and the Jodorowsky one that never quite happened.
Right. So, it's taken 4 attempts to get Dune right. This is the first time anyone.
I was going to say, you're not on the same Twitter I am if you think that. It's an interesting mix. I'll just put it that way. The Dune podcast is a whole separate.
That's a whole other podcast. Yeah. Well, all I was going to say is this is the first attempt at somebody to do Foundation for a TV series. So, who knows? In 20, 30 years, there might be another one, and it'll be a different take, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, it is beautiful. The whole show is amazing to look at in every frame. It is a painting, and not just Lee Pace's handsome face. It really is the effects are second to none. The everything kind of makes sense when you're looking at it. In a way that I don't think all sci-fi does when you're looking at it. If you're a fan of like Dune or The Expanse, it'll still be in your wheelhouse. Of course, everyone's going to have quibbles. I am
Sure.
fascinated to hear how different it is, but it doesn't surprise me to hear how different it is.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go, actually, I think I'm going to wait now till the series is finished this season. And then then I'll start cracking the books. But thank you so much for doing this, man.
Once you do podcast or not, I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts about the book.
Sure. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll at least read the first Foundation book after, and then we'll regroup and we'll do this again.
Cool.
All right, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And if you people want to yell at Juan, you can do it on the blog. Don't go find him. You can yell at me, and I'll relay what you yelled at about.
I won't give you my phone number.
All right. Thanks so much, dude. And we'll definitely do it again.
It's awesome. Sounds great.
That about wraps it up for this edition of The Signal Watch, a production of the League of Melbotus. Thanks for sticking with us. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to drop on by the Signal Watch blog, where you'll find write-ups of a wide variety of movies and more. We'd love to hear from you, so find us online and let us know what you think. Whether you prefer email, blog comments, or social media, we'll be happy to hear from you. We'll be back soon with more exceedingly high-quality content. So, until next time, God damn it, babies, you've got to be kind.